default to this, the marble statue version of history.
Right. The stern men in powdered wigs sitting in Philadelphia, calmly signing documents. It all feels so inevitable, dignified.
And completely wrong.
Oh,
I mean, if you could actually hear the audio from Carpenter's Hall in 1774, you would not hear dignified silence.
no, you'd hear chaos. You'd hear a room full of people who, let's be honest, didn't really like each other, all arguing over this high-stakes experiment in what we today call matrix management.
Matrix management is a very generous way to put it. It sounds more like a corporate nightmare, frankly.
Well, yeah.
Like we're talking about a group that had to fight the world's strongest military power while having, what, zero legal authority to tax anyone?
Exactly. And that is the paradox we're digging into in this deep dive. How did a quote-unquote government that was essentially a debating club, one that couldn't enforce its own laws and reported to 13 different bosses, how did they manage to defeat the British Empire?
And maybe more importantly, why was that system so flawed that it eventually just had to be scrapped entirely?
It's a fascinating story.
We've gone through the archives for this one Encyclopedia Britannica, the Office of the Historian, and the Congressional Records to piece it together.
Yeah.
Because when people say the Continental Congress, they kind of treat it like a single event.
But it's not. When you look at the timeline, it's really this 15-year saga with like 3 very distinct personalities.
Right.
You've got the reaction phase in 74, then the war management phase starting in 75, and then this confederation phase where they tried and largely failed to govern a country at peace.
Okay, so let's drop into Philadelphia, September 1774, the First Continental Congress. The context here, it isn't revolution yet, it's panic.
It's total panic. The British Parliament had just passed the coercive acts, or what the colonists were calling the intolerable acts.
And this was the spark.
This was the catalyst. Parliament had effectively closed the port of Boston. They had put Massachusetts under martial law. And the message to the other colonies was unmistakable. If we can do this to Boston, we can do it to Charleston. We can do it to New York.
So the colonies sent delegates to Philadelphia to figure out some kind of joint response. I'm looking at the roll call here. 56 delegates from 12 colonies. Well, wait, we've got 13 colonies? Where's Georgia?
Georgia is missing. It was a mix of things, but mostly just survival. Georgia was the newest and weakest colony. They were facing serious attacks from Native American tribes on their borders and were heavily reliant on British military support.
Oh, okay.
The loyalist sentiment there was really strong because they physically needed the king's protection. So, yeah, they set this one out.
But the heavy hitters showed up. You've got Washington, Patrick Henry, the Adams cousins.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the common assumption is that these guys walked in ready to, fight for independence. But the record suggests the exact opposite.
Independence was absolutely a fringe idea at this stage. I mean, if you mentioned it in 1774, you were considered a radical extremist. The goal was reconciliation.
Right.
They wanted to return to the status quo before 1763. In fact, and this surprises people, the Congress explicitly stated they willingly accepted parliamentary regulation of American commerce.
That's so hard to square with the slogans we learn, like no taxation without representation. That sounds like a demand for total economic freedom.
It does sound like it, but the nuance is all in that word, taxation. They were fine with Britain regulating trade routes or, setting tariffs to manage the empire.
Yeah.
What they drew the line at was direct taxation just to raise revenue, like the Stamp Act and having a standing army in peacetime. They were just arguing for their rights as Englishmen.
So if they aren't declaring war, they need leverage. And they decide to hit Britain in the wallet with this thing called the Continental Association.
Which was essentially a massive economic boycott. They pledged to stop importing British goods and eventually to stop exporting American goods to Britain. The theory was that British merchants would lose so much money they'd force Parliament to back down.
But when you look at the fine print of that agreement, you can see the cracks in their unity right away. They agreed to ban exports, except for rice.
That was the South Carolina delegation. They basically held the whole Congress hostage. They said, look, if we can't export our rice, our economy dies and we walk.
Wow.
So to keep the Union together, the Congress carved out this very specific exemption allowing rice exports to Europe. It's a perfect example of just how fragile this whole alliance was.
Oh, so they send a petition to King George III, not Parliament.
Right, because they saw Parliament as the aggressor.
And they adjourn, agreeing to meet again in May 1775 if things don't get better.
And, well, things did not get better.
To put it mildly, by the time they reconvened for the Second Continental Congress in May 1775, the timeline has just completely overtaken them.
It has. Lexington and Concord happened in April. The shot heard round the world has already been fired.
The whole mood has shifted.
Completely. We've got new blood in the room now. Benjamin Franklin shows up. Thomas Jefferson arrives. And suddenly this advisory committee is staring down a shooting war. They don't have a constitution. They don't have a treasury. But they have to start acting like a government.
And this is where the political maneuvering gets so fascinating. They adopt the militia forces outside Boston, but they need a commander. And appointing George Washington wasn't just about his military resume, was it?
Not at all. It was a purely calculated political move, engineered mostly by John Adams. The army in Boston was a New England army.
Right.
Adams knew that if the war stayed a New England problem, the South would never fully commit. They needed a Virginian in command to bind the Southern colonies to the cause. Washington was the physical embodiment of colonial unity.
But they still don't have the money to pay an army.
And that's the critical failure point. They had no power to tax. None. So to fund this war, they started printing their own currency, the Continental.
Which, as we said, is where we get the voice, not worth a Continental.
Precisely. It was hyperinflation as a strategy. They were printing money backed by nothing but the hope of winning the war. They created a postal service, a navy, a diplomatic corps, all while standing on financial quicksand.
And yet, even while they're printing money to fight the king, they sent him another letter, the Olive Branch Petition, in July 1775.
It seems schizophrenic to us, but you have to remember the internal politics. The moderates, led by John Dickinson in Pennsylvania, they were terrified of independence. They insisted on one last attempt at peace. The radicals allowed it, mostly because they knew it would fail.
And it failed spectacularly.
The king refused to even read it. Instead, in August of 75, he issued the Proclamation of Rebellion. He declared the colonies were in open and avowed rebellion and basically authorized the military to crush them.
That was the point of no return. He just slammed the door in their face.
That rejection is what finally gave the moderates permission to even consider independence. But, even then, it took another year of fighting before they finally voted on it.
And we should clarify, the Declaration of Independence wasn't just some philosophical document. It was a diplomatic tool.
It absolutely was. Because as long as they were just rebelling subjects, France couldn't get involved.
Right.
International law at the time was tricky. If France helped rebellious subjects, that was an act of war against Britain. But if the colonies declared themselves to be a separate sovereign nation,
then France could legally sign a treaty of alliance with them.
Exactly. They needed the declaration to get the gunpowder.
So now they have a war, a declaration, and an army. But how are they actually running this thing? We mentioned matrix management earlier. Let's dig into the structure because it seems almost designed to fail.
It was. Neil Olson, who studied the organizational culture of the Congress, describes it as an extreme form of matrix management without a CEO.
Okay, so imagine a board of directors where every decision needs consensus, but all the board members report to different companies.
That's a perfect analogy. The delegates didn't answer to a president of the United States.
They answer to their state legislatures.
Yes. And here is the kicker. Voting was en bloc. Each state got one vote. It didn't matter if you were Virginia with a massive population or Rhode Island with a tiny one. One state, one vote.
And what if a state's delegation was split on an issue?
Then the state's vote didn't count at all. So you had delegates arguing ferociously amongst themselves just to be able to cast a single vote. It paralyzed the process.
And they had term limits too, which sounds great in theory, drain the swamp and all that, but in the middle of a war.
It was chaotic. Under the later Confederation rules, you could only serve 3 years in any 6-year period. The turnover was constant. The average turnover rate was something like 37% a year.
A third of your committee is new every single year while you're trying to run a war.
Exactly. Why would they handicap themselves like that? Fear. You have to understand, their only reference point for government was George III and Parliament distant, entrenched, powerful. They were terrified of creating an American tyranny.
So they chose liberty over efficiency.
They deliberately built a weak government because they were afraid of a strong one. And Washington definitely felt the pain of that. His letters are just full of complaints about Congress being slow, indecisive, and, broke.
Like all other large bodies.
Yeah.
Their deliberations are slow. I mean, he's out there freezing at Valley Forge while Congress is debating procedural points just to buy shoes.
It's unbelievable.
So the war drags on. And eventually they realize they need to formalize this whole arrangement. This brings us to the Articles of Confederation, which get ratified in 1781. This is technically the first Constitution of the United States.
It is. The body becomes the Congress of the Confederation,
Hmm.
but government is a strong word for what they created. They called it a firm league of friendship.
Which sounds more like a book club than a nation.
And it functioned like one. The fatal flaw was still the power of the purse. The Confederation Congress could declare war, sign treaties, run the post office, but they could not tax.
So how did they pay for anything?
They used a requisition system. They'd calculate how much money they needed and then send a letter to each state saying, hey, Virginia, your share is $200,000. Please send it.
It was a suggestion jar.
Essentially. And the states usually paid only a fraction of what was asked, if they paid anything at all. James Madison later wrote that the system was destitute of sanction.
Right, there's no consequence for ignoring it.
Exactly. And this lack of money didn't just mean unpaid bills, it meant physical danger. We have to talk about the nomadic Congress. We picture them in Independence Hall, but in 1783, they were literally chased out of town.
By their own soldiers?
By their own unpaid soldiers. This is the low point, the Pennsylvania Mutiny of 1783. Soldiers from the Continental Army surrounded Independence Hall and held the government hostage.
And because Congress couldn't tax, they couldn't pay them. And because they couldn't raise a federal army, they couldn't even defend themselves.
Pennsylvania refused to use its state militia to protect them, so the Congress just fled. They moved to Princeton, meeting in Nassau Hall, then Annapolis, then Trenton, meeting in a tavern.
A tavern.
The French Arms Tavern, yes. Finally, they ended up in New York. I mean, think about the optics of that. Foreign ambassadors arriving to negotiate with the United States, and they have to chase the government from a college campus to a bar. It destroyed their legitimacy.
And yet, and this is the part that is genuinely impressive, despite being broke, homeless, and paralyzed, they secure the Treaty of Paris in 1783.
It's a massive achievement. They successfully negotiated the end of the Revolutionary War and got Great Britain to recognize American independence with incredibly favorable borders. They won the war. But the tragedy of the Confederation Congress is that they just couldn't win the peace.
Right. The post-war period is where the wheels really fall off. But before the crash, they managed one last piece of legislation that changed everything. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787.
This is their greatest legacy. The Congress controlled the vast territory north of the Ohio River. Now, the easy path would have been to just let states like Virginia and Pennsylvania expand westward.
Creating these massive superstates.
Exactly, but the Congress said no. They established federal control over the land and set the precedent that new territories would enter the Union as new states on equal footing with the original 13. This is why we have Ohio and Michigan, not a greater Virginia stretch into the Pacific.
But while they were drawing maps, the economy was collapsing. And that leads us to Shays' Rebellion in 1786.
This was the wake-up call. Farmers in western Massachusetts, many of them veterans, were losing their farms to debt. They rose up and seized courthouses. It was an internal insurrection.
And the federal government could do what?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. They had no money to raise an army to stop it. Massachusetts had to rely on a privately funded militia to put down the rebellion. And it terrified the elite Washington, Madison, Hamilton. They realized the whole experiment would fail if the government was too weak to maintain order.
It's telling that by this point, attendance in Congress had just plummeted.
It was a ghost town. The most talented people, Jefferson, Adams, they stayed in their state legislatures or went abroad because that's where the real power was. Congress struggled to even get a quorum to vote on basic things.
So the writing is on the wall. We get the Annapolis Convention, which fails, and then the Philadelphia Convention of 1787.
Which was sold to the public as a meeting to revise the Articles of Confederation. But once the delegates got there, Washington, Madison, Hamilton, they locked the doors and threw the articles in the trash. They wrote a completely new constitution.
It was basically a hostile takeover.
In a legal sense, yes. The articles required unanimous consent to be changed. The new constitution said, we only need 9 states to ratify this, and then we're the new government. They just bypassed the old system entirely.
There is a detail about the very, very end of the Continental Congress that I find surprisingly moving. The transition happens in 1789. What happened to the old one?
It just faded away. On March 2nd, 1789, the final scheduled meeting of the Continental Congress took place. One member showed up. Philip Pell of New York.
Just one guy in the room?
Just Philip. He looked around the empty chamber, banged the gavel, and adjourned the Congress sign die indefinitely. And that was it. The body that declared independence didn't go out with a bang. It went out with one guy realizing nobody else was coming to the meeting.
It's a quiet end, but we shouldn't let that obscure what they actually did. We
Mhm.
tend to judge the Continental Congress as a failure because it was so inefficient. But is that the right metric?
I don't think so. I mean, if you judge them by the standards of a modern, efficient state, sure, they failed. But if you look at it from the organizational culture view, they were a leaderless group that achieved every single one of their primary goals. They relieved Boston, they got foreign alliances, they defeated the British Empire.
And they established a republic.
Mm.
And, crucially, they allowed themselves to be replaced.
That is the key. They created a system, realized it was flawed, and stepped aside for a better one without a civil war. That is an incredibly rare thing in the history of revolutions.
It really forces us to rethink that trade-off between efficiency and liberty. The Continental Congress was designed to be slow because they thought speed led to tyranny.
And that's the provocative thought for us today, isn't it? We complain constantly about gridlock in government. We want things to move faster. But the Continental Congress proved you can have liberty without efficiency, though you might go broke doing it.
The question is whether we've found the right balance yet, or if we're still just tweaking the machinery they started building back in 1774.
I think the tweaking never ends. That's the nature of the experiment.
Well, on that note, we'll let you get back to your own committee meetings. Hopefully they're a little less chaotic than the ones in Carpenter's Hall. Thanks for listening to this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
See you next time.